Picture this scene for a moment. You are standing on an endless sheet of ice. The temperature is 40 degrees below zero. The wind howls like a starving beast, ripping through your clothes as if they were paper. Beneath your feet, there is no solid ground, only fragile plates of ice that crack and groan with every single step. Above you, there is no sky, just a blinding, merciless white that swallows the horizon and the abyss alike. No food, no shelter, no hope of survival. Now, look around you. 27 men are staring back at you. Their frozen, hollow eyes ask you a single, terrifying question: will you kill me so you can live? Or will you save me? This was not a movie. This was the life of Ernest Shackleton. In 1914, this unknown Anglo-Irishman sailed straight into the frozen heart of hell. He never reached the South Pole. He never fulfilled his lifelong dream. But he achieved something far more extraordinary. He brought all 28 of his men back home alive. After 2 full years, trapped in the most hostile place on Earth, with no contact with the outside world and no hope of rescue. How? That is the story we will tell you today. (1874) Ireland. Ernest Henry Shackleton was born into a house of opposites. His father, a stern, unyielding Quaker from Yorkshire, believed only in discipline and duty. But his mother? She was a wild, warm-hearted Irishwoman who lived to break the rules. This strange, volatile mixture shaped his mind forever. From his father, he learned the art of strategy and planning. From his mother, he learned the secret of winning men's hearts. When he was just 10 years old, his family was uprooted to the grey, dreary outskirts of London. There, the local children found an easy target. They sneered at him, calling him Mick with all the cruelty of the playground. But Ernest was no weakling. One afternoon, he saw a bully beating a smaller child. Without a second thought, he stepped in, shattered the bully's confidence, and put an end to the torment for good. In his tiny bedroom, he devoured adventure novels, Jules Verne, Rider Haggard. His heart burned with a longing for exploration, a longing that defied his father's wish for him to become a doctor. Finally, father and son struck a strange bargain. At 16, he would join the merchant navy. His father was certain that a single year of brutal, back-breaking labor would cure him of this fantasy. He could not have been more wrong. Ernest's grades in mathematics and navigation soared. He stepped aboard his first ship, faced a howling storm, and found himself standing on the deck, defying the waves with a wild grin. By 1898, at just 24 years old, he had earned the rank of Master Mariner. But it was never enough. He wanted the unknown. He wanted the pole. And he wanted a name that would outlive him. 1901, London. Shackleton is now 27 years old, newly married to Emily, who is carrying their first child. She looked him straight in the eye and asked, "You are going to the South Pole, aren't you?" He answered her with brutal honesty, "I must." That year, Britain announced a national expedition, led by the cold, rigid disciplinarian Robert Falcon Scott. Shackleton applied, and his relentless enthusiasm earned him a place on the crew. They sailed south. Scott chose 3 men for the first attempt to reach the pole: Scott himself, Wilson, and Ernest Shackleton. Out on the white desert, Shackleton was struck down by scurvy. His face swelled into a grotesque mask. He began to cough up blood. Yet they pushed on, reaching the farthest south any human had ever traveled. But on the return journey, Shackleton could no longer walk. Scott made a ruthless decision. He ordered Shackleton to be placed on a sledge and dragged across the ice like cargo. Imagine the humiliation. The ambitious explorer, reduced to a helpless child, pulled along by his comrades while the frost gnawed at his flesh. Back in England, he was paraded as a failure. The newspapers wrote cruelly, he was not as strong as the others. But Shackleton saw things differently. He saw that Scott had made a fatal mistake, using ponies instead of dogs. He knew the glory was closer than ever. He raised the funds, borrowed the designs, and declared with defiant boldness he would return to the pole. And this time, he would be the one in command. 1908, New Zealand. Shackleton arrived aboard a repurposed seal hunting vessel named the Nimrod. She was half the size of Scott's ship, but she was all he could afford. His plan was audacious: sail through thick, treacherous ice to save precious weeks of travel. They arrived, set up camp, and on October 29th, Shackleton set off south with 3 men and 4 sledges pulled by Manchurian ponies. He was wrong. The ice shattered beneath them. The ponies crashed through the crevasses and were butchered by men who wept as they did it. They stopped 850 kilometers from the pole, but Shackleton pressed on with just 3 men, hauling the sledge themselves. They climbed the Beardmore Glacier, a monstrous river of ice no human had ever set foot on. With its sheer drops, bottomless crevasses, and temperatures plunging to 53 degrees below zero. They climbed nearly 1,000 vertical meters of solid ice. After 3 months of relentless walking, on January 9, 1909, they stopped dead in their tracks. They were just 180 kilometers from the pole. On normal ground, it would be a 2-day stroll. Here, it was a death sentence. In that moment, Shackleton did what Scott never did. He turned back. The food was gone. Their bodies were shattered. Their faces were consumed by frostbite. One more step forward, and they would never return. He raised the British flag, declared he had reached the farthest south in history, and then turned his back without a single glance behind. On the return journey, he gave his last biscuit to Frank Wilde, who was groaning with starvation. Wilde wrote later, "I do not think any man in the world could have shown such generosity. I wept like a child." He returned a national hero, knighted by the king. But he knew the bitter truth: he had failed again. And another man was plotting to steal his dream, Roald Amundsen of Norway. Yet Shackleton had no idea that his most famous journey was not about reaching the pole. It was about surviving hell itself. August 1914. The world is on fire with war. In the midst of the madness, Shackleton stood in the Admiralty office and presented a proposal that no one cared to hear. Winston Churchill glanced at him and answered simply, "Proceed." On the 1st of August, the Endurance sailed from Plymouth, away from the bloodshed, straight toward the ice. On board were 28 men. 6 weeks into the voyage, just 1 day shy of sighting the continent, the nightmare began. Furious polar winds pushed the pack ice around the ship like a tightening noose. The sea froze solid in a single night, turning the vessel into a prisoner inside a frozen cage. They tried to break the ice with axes and dynamite. They failed. At night, they heard a terrifying groan. The ice was crushing the wooden hull, slowly, relentlessly. Then, on October 27, 1915, the structure began to collapse. Icy water surged inside. Shackleton ordered an immediate evacuation. They climbed onto the solid ice and watched their ship die. On November 21st, they all stood in silence and watched the Endurance sink. It took 2.5 hours. The ice devoured her hull like the jaws of a colossal whale. Then she vanished, leaving only a trail of air bubbles rising to the surface like final, dying breaths. Imagine that moment. 28 men, standing on a slab of floating ice no larger than a football field, surrounded by an endless frozen ocean, with a polar winter approaching, bringing total darkness and deadly cold. They had lost everything: the ship, the prepared food, the hope of arrival. All that remained were 3 small wooden lifeboats, torn tents, and a few weeks' worth of rations. Shackleton gathered his men. He looked into the fear in their eyes. Then he spoke his most famous words: "The journey may take months, but I promise you this: we will all return home together, or we will all die here together." November 1915. 28 men on a drifting ice floe, a ship without a sail. The currents were pushing them north, away from the continent, which meant the ice beneath them was slowly melting. They began eating their own dogs, their hands trembling, their tears freezing to their cheeks. Open wounds refused to heal. Their soaked clothing weighed them down like burial shrouds. Every night, Shackleton would wander between the tents, laughing, telling jokes, boosting their spirits. But in the dark, he was thinking of only one thing: how do I get them out of this hell? In April 1916, after 5 months of living on the drifting ice, it began to break apart beneath them. He gave the order to launch the boats into the freezing water. A wild sea, crashing ice floes like boulders, water at the temperature of death, and 3 tiny open boats carrying 28 exhausted men, rowing for over 700 kilometers. For 7 relentless days, they rowed through polar storms. Freezing rain glued itself to their faces, blinding them. The salt water froze onto their clothes, turning into armor of solid ice. On April 15th, they saw dark lines on the horizon: Elephant Island. A barren, rocky wasteland with no shelter, no food, and no fresh water. But it was better than dying at sea. They stumbled ashore and collapsed onto the stones like dead men. Yet Shackleton knew the truth. The island was 1,300 kilometers from the nearest port. No one knew they were there. He had 2 choices: wait to die, or do something no human had ever done. Without a moment's hesitation, he chose the second. April 24th, 1916. Shackleton chose 5 of his strongest men. He set sail with them in a 7-meter-long, completely open whaler named the James Caird. They had a broken compass, a meticulously drawn map, and a handful of supplies. He left 22 men behind on Elephant Island, waiting for death or deliverance. 6 men in a boat the size of a small car, sailing through one of the most savage oceans on Earth. Waves over 10 meters high. The wind howling like a starving animal. The freezing salt water coated the boat and the sail in thick layers of ice, weighing them down, threatening to capsize them. They bailed water with their bare hands in a frantic, relentless rhythm. They could not sleep, because sleep meant death. On the 8th day, the largest wave yet broke over them. The boat shot up as if it were climbing a mountain, then plunged into an abyss. The sea swallowed them whole. But by a miracle, she rose back to the surface. The men wept and prayed all at once. Shackleton rowed just like the others, but he was the night watchman, the one who read the terror in their eyes. On the morning of the 16th day, the fog parted for a single moment. They saw it, towering black mountains covered in white snow. South Georgia. Some of them wept like children, but Shackleton did not smile. They were on the wrong side, a desolate, uninhabited coast. Behind them lay mountains that had never been mapped. And beyond those mountains lay the whaling station. There was no sea route. He made his final decision. They would cross those mountains. May 19th, 1916. Only 3 men remained: Shackleton, Worsley, and Crean. They were so exhausted they could barely stand. Their fingers were black as coal from frostbite. They had no map, no climbing equipment, and they were about to scale icy, jagged mountains in the pitch-black night of the polar winter. The ice was as slippery as glass. The slopes were as sheer as walls. They climbed with their broken fingernails and bleeding feet. At one point, they reached a near-vertical drop of 300 meters. Shackleton climbed it first, like a cat, digging his bare, frost-bitten feet into the solid ice while blood trickled from his toes. The ascent and descent continued for 36 hours without a single moment of sleep or a bite of food. At one point, Shackleton turned to Worsley and said, "I have lost all feeling in my feet." Worsley replied with chilling calm, "So have I." But they both knew stopping meant death. On the morning of the second day, they reached the summit of the final ridge. They looked down and saw it, calm, blue water, and wooden buildings with smoke rising from their chimneys. The Stromness whaling station. They descended with deadly caution, rolling down the snow until they reached the valley. There, they heard the most beautiful sound in the world, the steam whistle of a whaling boat. The music of life. Shackleton ran toward the station. He stumbled, fell, rose like a madman, and burst through the main door. Inside, the Norwegian manager, Thorolf Sorley, was eating his breakfast. He stared in disbelief at the wild, ragged creature before him, face blackened with frostbite, clothes in tatters, eyes sunken into dark hollows. Sorley asked, trembling, "Who are you?" Shackleton replied in a hoarse, broken whisper, "My name is Shackleton. I have 22 men waiting for me on Elephant Island. I need your help immediately. Every hour means another man's death." He did not eat. He did not sleep. He only asked for a new boat. In the following days, he tried to sail back 3 times and failed every time due to the storms. But he never gave up. On August 30th, he chartered a Chilean ship, the Yelcho, and sailed it himself to the island. When he arrived, he saw them 22 men standing on the beach, waving frantically, weeping, screaming his name. All of them alive. All of them had waited, because he had promised them. He stepped ashore and embraced every single man. He looked at them and said, "I have come to take you home." 28 men walked into hell, and 28 men walked out. Not a single loss. A miracle that has never been repeated in the history of polar exploration. January 5th, 1922. South Georgia, the very place where he had found his salvation. Shackleton stood on the deck of his new ship, heading toward yet another expedition. The dream that had always eluded him was chasing him like a ghost. Suddenly, a sharp, searing pain struck his chest. He collapsed onto the wooden deck and breathed his last, quiet breath. He died of a heart attack in the heart of the eternal ice, on his way to a dream he would never see. The greatest irony? The man who survived the impossible died so simply aboard a ship. His wife, Emily, asked for him to be buried in South Georgia, far from the formality of England. There he lies today, in a tiny graveyard overlooking the frozen sea. His headstone carries a simple inscription, Ernest Henry Shackleton, Polar Explorer. No titles, no achievements, just his bare name. But his legacy is larger than any engraving. In an age when heroism was measured by miles and flags, Shackleton measured his greatness differently, by the number of souls he brought back. How many leaders in history have lost their men to blind ambition? Napoleon in the Russian snow. Scott, who died with his 4 companions in the Antarctic just 2 years after Shackleton's voyage frozen within miles of food. Shackleton could have sacrificed his men for glory. but he chose to be a human being first and an explorer second. When the newspapers asked him, "Were you not disappointed that you never reached the pole?" he gave his eternal answer, "I would rather be a failed commander than a dead hero." Today, his story is taught in business schools as the ultimate case study in crisis leadership. In Frank Worsley's memoirs, he wrote a line that cuts to the heart. If it hadn't been for Shackleton, none of us would be here to write these words. He gave us life twice. On Elephant Island, a small wooden cross still stands, bearing all their names. Explorers stand there in silence under the polar sky, contemplating the miracle. As for Shackleton, he rests peacefully beneath the eternal snow, far from the glory he once sought. But his story lives on, a reminder that true heroism is not about being the first to the summit. It is about never leaving anyone behind, no matter the cost. And so, Ernest Shackleton never reached the South Pole. But he reached something far more enduring, the hearts of those who knew him, and a place in history as one of the greatest leaders humanity has ever known. A man who failed in every dream, yet succeeded in the most precious thing a person can achieve, being the reason for others to live.